Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Pandemics are nothing new, says Iain King. That might sound a little trite when COVID-19 has caused so much turmoil in our lives. But the point is that there's plenty of historic precedent to guide us through this and make predictions about the future. And that's exactly what he's done. Iain is live with us here, joining us from Bethesda, just outside Washington, D.C. Hello, Iain.
Hello there, how are you?
I'm good. Glad to get you online. We were worried there for a moment, but we've got you now. Iain, you made 7 predictions in all, pretty much at the start of the pandemic. So we've got an opportunity here to see how much they've held up, and also add some new reflections. But just to start with going, can you tell us a bit about your own background, who you are, what you've done, and what qualifies you to make these predictions, Iain?
Thank you very much. That's a very fair question. I suppose I've had a bit of an eclectic career. If there's a trend, it's that I've tended to work overseas. I started out with some 7 years after university on the Northern Ireland peace process during the 1990s. Then a stint in Kosovo, where I worked alongside you, while I was with the European Union and the UN, time in Afghanistan, Syria, and fairly recently working at the British Embassy in Washington, DC, just down the road. But when I did the video, I was actually working for a think tank, for CSIS, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. And at that time, as the pandemic was just emerging in the spring, we were all keen to try and work out what was going to happen. This was an event which was really quite new to living memory. AIDS is perhaps the only example of something similar that people can really remember in their lifetimes. And even that's not really a direct comparison because of the way AIDS and COVID are quite different in other ways. So it was an effort to look back at history and see what lessons could be learnt. Were there any parallels? Were there any consistent events which happen when a pandemic strikes, and to see what we could learn from it?
Okay, well, we've got a list of those predictions you made here, and we're going to steal from the centre's website. And we've got all 7 of those. So if we just bring up those slides now, we should be able to go through them one by one, and we're gonna rattle through them, and then we're going to go back over them afterwards to see how much they go through. So Iain, if you want to say next on each slide, so this is your first point, militarism stalls. Just explain a bit more here about this one.
Yes, so in the olden days, and by the olden days I really mean from 100 years and beforehand, when you had a serious pandemic, it reduced manpower. And when you reduce manpower, it's much harder to begin offensive military operations. And this means that it tends to be wars of choice which get turned down, which means it tends to be the offensive side in an ongoing war which reduces its battle power. Several times this has happened, Greece and Rome being the most obvious cases. It's meant that they were close to stamping out their enemies, and then they just failed at the last hurdle when the plague struck and they had to retrench. I can go through the degree to which this has been borne out during the course of 2020. If you want to, we can say that to the end. I mean,
well, let's go through. Let's just rattle through these, and then we'll go back over again, and we can jump back into the website if we want to. So that was the first thing, and that's probably a fairly. I think that's something that people would have in mind. We'd all think, governments and states have really got to be preoccupied by their own affairs. And so if you're thinking about launching an offensive, it might not, be the best time to do it. But I know there's some exceptions, and we'll come back to that in a second. So let's go on to the next one.
Yes. So government authority is doubted. So the key thing here is that authority figures often get their kudos, their acceptance, their legitimacy from their ability to protect populations. And although we tend to think of that as defense from outside attack, from straightforward attack, it also includes defense from health threats. And so if the government's doing something which is failing to keep people safe, people are going to look to other sources of authority. This applies notably in the article to Christianity and faith leaders, particularly important in the Middle Ages, as well as traditional governmental figures.
Right. Okay. I love that bit about Salahuddin being caught up in the was it typhus, I think, and then his sort of, kingdom being split up after him. Superstition. This is a really good one. I like this one.
So this is right. So again, when the traditional modes of information and knowledge gathering are seen to falter because, again, they've been proven to fail because they've failed to defend against a major health crisis, people wander off into other means of gathering information and forming views. And this often takes them into quite odd territory, the world of fake news and superstition. I think I included there or in the video the case of people who wore belts of special material to try and save them from tuberculosis. And there are many other cases of quite weird things. The modern equivalent of things like 5G being associated with COVID and vaccine hesitancy and lots of querying of the figures, which goes beyond what you might regard as normal, rigorous analysis of the fact into quite, frankly, quite loopy territory.
I love the bit about the dead relatives rising from the graves. And so the idea that they can only be stopped by impaling them with a stake through the heart.
Yes.
Which is, we live next to a graveyard, it'd be a bit problematic. Next one.
So xenophobia. So again, so often you hear of viruses and diseases and plagues being described as coming from somewhere else. So, the Spanish flu came from anywhere. If you live in Spain, you probably wouldn't call it the Spanish flu, you'd call it somewhere else. And there are several other cases of this, of place A calling a virus after place B and vice versa. We've had quite a bit of that this time. Some of it is a deliberate attempt to spread it, such as efforts to call it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus. And there's been many other cases as well. It's maybe been slightly less prominent this time with this disease than it has been with others, but there's still an element of xenophobia. And the way to test it is, I bet pretty much everybody listening to this call will think that there's an area far from them that they regard as other, which is affected much more badly, much worse than they are affected. And if you think about it, that can't be true for everybody, and yet most people think that. So I suspect there's still quite a considerable element of this in the modern COVID crisis.
It's a natural instinct, isn't it? It's just a survival instinct. Things can't be really that bad where you are, or as bad as people might think they might be. Yeah. Okay, lesson 5. Next one.
New economic winners and losers. So absolutely. So again, plague in the past has often been one of the big determinants of a downturn in the economy, and often quite a significant downturn. The biggest one by far was the Black Death, which really stopped European development in its track and set it back by something like 2 centuries. But it also meant that the Roman Empire, when it tried to get back after being sacked in Rome and was based in Istanbul, then Constantinople, couldn't really re-establish itself as it tried to in the 500 AD under Justinian. It's definitely been the case this time, partly again because the COVID crisis has had huge economic effects. One of the things here, though, which is slightly different, is that in the past, plagues and pandemics have tended to reduce wealth, whereas COVID has tended to reduce income. And what that's meant is that whereas in the past, plagues tended to have a leveling effect where they affected the rich people much more, COVID has tended to have a greater impact, certainly in the short term and the medium term, on poorer people and people who are dependent on customer-facing work. They've either had to keep their jobs, often low-paying jobs, despite considerable personal health risks, or they've lost their jobs as those businesses have shut down. Whereas you found the super rich people, Jeff Bezos and many others, have found that their wealth actually gone up. So there have been new economic winners and losers this time, but they've actually been quite different than they have been in the past.
Okay, we're creeping now into the observations about what's going on.
We are, aren't we? Yes.
Right. Yes, we'll try and stick to what the historic predictions you made at the beginning, and then we'll come back again over them. So 6.
Some groups suffer more than others. So again, this is partly an issue to do with the background of genetics. So often when you find a pandemic comes, it doesn't strike the whole world at once. In the past, when we've had pandemics, they've tended to be arising from the mixture of cultures. So typically from people coming from Europe to the New World to America, either North America or Central or South America. And so some of the cases sort of 500 years ago when Spanish people arrived with infected with diseases that they themselves had developed an immunity towards, they proved lethal in a mass sort of way. Often 80, 90, in one case 98% lethality within a generation. Sort of about 500 years ago. And this has happened in a number of other cases as well. So when you had the Silk Road type viruses coming through, again, the Black Death, that was a case of something coming from Eastern Asia into Europe again, mass fatalities, in that case, some 40% of Europeans killed. This time, because it's essentially a new disease, which has come and affected us from zoological disease, from animals, it's slightly different in that sense. But nonetheless, there still is a mixed pattern of impact.
Okay, we're coming on to your last one.
Yes, so this is one of the interesting ones in that collective shock. And also there's a key thing here is often there's the delayed impact. So the way of thinking of the delayed impact is the way American cinema has responded to the Vietnam War. Whereas if you think about the Vietnam War, obviously it was kind of winding down in the early 70s and into the mid 70s. And it was really only in the early 80s and the mid 80s that it came to be a prominent issue in American cinema and American culture, even as some of the political figures were trying to move on and the defense culture, policy-making community was trying to move on. We also see books and art, music, architecture. Some of these things come to be designed with an eye to a reference to what's gone in the past. So if you walk around London, for example, you can often find several parts of London which are actually named after elements to do with the Black Death. So there's Blackheath in the south east of London, Mort Lake, Mort meaning dead, where they just put dead in literally put dead people in a lake in the southwest, and there's a few other places like that. And these places come to not only give their name to a place, but also some of the ways in which certain things are constructed, but to do with the size of roads and other architectural elements. Cemeteries around Moscow, again, for example, as mentioned in the article, they had a mass pandemic in the 1770s and built a huge ring road, essentially, of burial ground, and that came to design the cityscape of Moscow.
Yeah.
So again, be interesting to see.
Let's keep we'll keep the sort of PowerPoint in the background, and we can sort of dip back into it when we want. So maybe Isabel, just keep the that there. I thought it was you were very it was a very comprehensive survey of things. What just at the outset, what do you think you've missed out on? If you think of that back to those 7 points, what's really struck you over the last 9 months?
It's a very good question. So all pandemics are different. What's different about this pandemic is, although it's killing a tragically large number of people, the number of people being killed in itself is not actually the impact. It's almost the scare impact. So in the worst cases, we're having 0.5% of a country's population dying, which is a tragically number of thousands or even potentially into the millions of people. But that in itself doesn't actually have a huge impact on the economy, especially when many of those people are old. But what it does have, and it has a big effect, is on the need to try and respond to that in terms of the way the government is respected, in terms of public perceptions, public fears, and obviously health impacts and economic impacts. So in some ways, it's the secondary impacts of COVID rather than the primary impact in terms of killing people, which sets this pandemic apart.
Just by way of comparison, can you talk about, for example, the Black Death's impact on Europe? And obviously, the role of the state is very minimal there, and so the ability to respond to it, and also the demand on the state to respond is so much different. And then perhaps maybe the pandemic of 1918, by which time you do have a full state system.
So one of the things, so the Black Death is probably the biggest plague that we're familiar with in Western culture. And I think it's bigger than plagues that have struck most cultures, apart from maybe the ones in the New World when European settlers arrived some 500 years ago. So in the Black Death, you're looking at roughly 40% of people being killed off. This was skewed towards sicker people, but it was so widespread, it was pretty indiscriminate. It was much slower in its spread than COVID. So COVID spread really around the world in sort of 3 or 4 months, and after being detected about 13 months ago or 12 months ago, it was kind of in every country by March, April time. With the Black Death, there were some villages, some communities which managed to resist it for about 5 years before they then succumbed. So you had de facto lockdown, but it was locally instituted. It wasn't government directed. People did it for themselves. They took quite unusual measures, but sensible measures to try and make themselves safe. There's cases, you can still see them now in some villages in England, where they have a stone gatepost with a little carving out of it, which used to be filled with vinegar. So they'd get goods bread, for example, supplied to them, and they'd leave the coins in vinegar as a means of payment. The vinegar would disinfect the coins in an effort to keep them safe. But the effects were very, very long lasting as well. So you had, for example, with all these people dying, there was a massive dearth, a lack of labourers in the fields. This meant that you had a big problem with trying to find people who are going to work, and the landowners generally got quite poor to try and make it, and that meant the king was poor. To try and get the king to try and get money, he introduced a poll tax. That's a standard levy on every person, which led to riots and political upheaval. So, but that was some 30 or 40 years after you had the main first wave of the Black Death. And it took some 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries for the population to recover where it had been before, which again is a massive setback. Similarly, also with the impact on the economy, which was similar in the same way.
So because we're not used to, we live in a world where we have instantaneous remedies for disease. We're not used to disease, but also because we're so interconnected. You've got a disease that can expand very, very quickly, and we don't have experience of it. Yet we have the expectation that government should be able to deal with it rapidly. And I guess as the consequence of that is that we are inflicting pain upon ourselves in terms of putting those lockdowns on the economy. The one of the things I wanted to take on from that was you talked about the wealthier class being affected as the most, and then you talked a bit about it. It would seem to me that the wealthy are quite well protected in this, and that it's the fact that if you live on a daily wage, you're the most vulnerable.
So that's right, and here it's interesting to distinguish between the economic effects and the health effects. So with some diseases in the past, cholera, for example, being a classic case, that's very discriminatory in terms of how fit you are, whether you're going to suffer, and how well fed you are. And so this meant that Louis Napoleon, who was a relative of Napoleon Bonaparte, some 50 years after Napoleon, was able to visit cholera sufferers, knowing he himself would be safe because he was well fed and basically healthy. Whereas the people he was meeting obviously were suffering. So from a health perspective, you have great diversity, but from an economic perspective, it will vary according to the disease. So people, as you say, who had to go out to work, who had to expose themselves to provide a living wage, were often in great danger in the past. And there are cases of people who, in the tragedy of the plague in London in 1665, who were paid, frankly, not very much money for one of the riskiest jobs there is, which is to go house to house and pull out the dead bodies.
Bring out your dead.
Yeah, an absurdly risky thing to do, and they certainly didn't have PPE, protective equipment at the time. So
yeah. I mean, do we know about mortality rates among health care workers and doctors? I mean, do you have?
That's a good question, and that's something I've not really delved into. Often you find people have develop an immunity, and once that immunity becomes clear, then it kind of establishes itself. But yes, it has been being a health worker in ancient times has generally been a risky profession.
Right. Okay. I've got tons of questions. I'm going to keep on asking them, but I'm encouraging people to start asking their own questions so they can put them to you live as well. Andy Mendes, I know, has got a question, so we'll bring Andy on in just a second. Let's go back to your first point about militarism. The nature of conflict has changed. We no longer, warfare is no longer about launching missiles, tanks, or even soldiers into other countries. It's taken a different pattern. So what have we seen in terms of conflict during this period?
So during 2020, and just before this call, I looked on and tried to work out what the data shows to find out whether my prediction had turned true. And the result is mixed. So if you look where conflict increased during 2020, it was the Sahel region. So Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, which are areas, if you like, which have traditional warfare based on large-scale manpower, but they didn't really suffer very many manpower deaths, partly because those communities, another prediction which wasn't on the street actually, which is that the developing world would be hit hardest, has turned out not to be true. A number of reasons for that. But by and large, militarism has stalled. So, for example, when we had the standoff between India and China earlier in the year, in the summer, so only 63 soldiers were killed. And that could obviously, maybe if it wasn't for COVID, that could have been a mass conflagration with mass armies on either side and all the rest of it. So that's just a guess. Maybe it wouldn't have been, maybe it would have been standoff too. But several other standoffs have remained relatively calm. It's exactly a year ago since the assassination of General Soleimani in Iran. That could easily have flared up into something much bigger, much worse, but it didn't. And again, some of the other conflicts have not ignited in the way that they have. So drawing a direct causal link with COVID is difficult, but the fact that there's so many conflicts which kind of didn't happen in 2020 suggests militarism has more or less stalled or been calmed down a bit.
The one great big dividing point I see is that you've got aging populations and wealthy developed economies whose economies have been hit very hard by it, and where you do have relatively high death tolls. And then you see developing economies with very young populations actually doing pretty well. Could you perhaps talk about the latter?
Yes, so this is the thing. So in the early days, it was expected that the disease would come through the well-connected, the richer countries, and it did start with China, Belgium, UK, Italy. Some of the most connected countries had the first wave and the first hits, and we were expecting that when it got to the poorer countries, they wouldn't have the infrastructure, the credibility in government to be able to cope with lockdowns, and lockdown at the time was seen to be the way of dealing with it. Nor would they have the health measures that you need to cope with people who are suffering from it, such as ventilators or oxygen machines and so on. Generally, what's tended to happen is that the age impact of COVID has been so stark, so age correlates so strongly with COVID. I think by one measure, your chance of suffering from it and dying from it increases, it doubles with 6 years of age. The correlation's that strong. Because poorer countries tend to have a lower life expectancy, they miss out, and also they have a bottom-heavy population pyramid, because their birth rates are often quite high. It means the proportion of people they have who are old is often quite low, so they have fewer people who are going to die from it. Also, some of them are less urbanized, and so if they're able to remain distanced in a rural setting, then they're more likely to be safe.
Yeah, it's really struck me. We've done one panel on South Africa, and the thing that we all were concerned about was that it would get into the townships and would have a big effect, and it hasn't. And there's TB and there's HIV there, and we still really haven't got to the bottom of yet why that hasn't really taken hold in a big way. So let's bring in some questions now. So we've got Andy Mendes first, followed by Sheila de Beleg. So Andy, go ahead.
Great.
Need to open your microphone. There you go.
Yep, right. Hello, Ian. It's a sort of a UK-based question, but it may be more widely. One thing that in amongst all the mayhem in this last 9 months, I've hardly heard a politician start without the phrase "following the science," whereas 2 years before or 3 years before, we had the famous Michael Gove misquote, which said, "I've had enough of experts." Now, I'm sure there's other reasons for that, but I guess my question is, do you think, and it is the experience of the other pandemics, something that suggests that thinking will persist? And I'm, given my particular hat, I'm very hopeful it will persist, at least in terms of climate change. Or is it something that will just disappear in the ether as soon as the last vaccination is completed?
That's a very fair question, a very good question. And there's a historical reference to this as well, in that in the past, people often, governmental leaders of the time, often monarchs and sovereigns, often tried to attach themselves quite tightly to religious leaders. So in the Black Death, if you look at how people cope with the Black Death, they tried to bring in the legitimacy of religious leaders to back up their policies and their proclamations. While I would like to be optimistic on the climate change issue, I suspect it won't happen. The reason being that the political dynamics of what you need to deal with climate change are quite different from what you need to deal with a pandemic, and that climate change is generally a long-term issue where the impact is much wider and harder to connect with individual actions at a particular time. Whereas in a pandemic, although there's a collective responsibility and a collective impact, it's generally shorter term and people can see it and they can feel it and understand it. And if they know somebody who lives down the street who's died, then it feels very real to them. So I suspect that the following the science line is, as much as anything, it's an effort to borrow legitimacy from scientists. It may lead in after action reviews. A year from now, I expect there to be big reviews in Britain, America, many other countries, what went right, what went wrong. And I suspect, rightly or wrongly, often generally unfairly, some scientists will come in for criticism in the way they've made calls. So I don't see it being a long-term trend myself, but I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong.
You don't see what being a long-term trend, trusting the experts? Sorry, just to phrase that specifically.
Trusting science and trusting experts. So just to back this up, if you look at how countries have performed, there's generally been a misnomer, and you've seen this particularly in the British press, between a false choice between shutting the economy and doing health term measures. And the reason it's a false choice is if you look at how governments have generally responded, they've either acted swiftly and decisively, in which case they've had not much health impact and they had not much economic impact. So New Zealand is the classic case there, but it's also actually true of China, which hasn't really had a GDP setback. Its GDP might have risen in 2020, one of the only countries that has. And also it hasn't actually had a great population impact. If you look at the proportional population impact, it's quite small. And then there's another group of countries which kind of the other end, and this includes Belgium, Britain, America, Mexico, which have had both a big economic hit and a big population COVID hit, where we've had the highest death rates. So that shows that the supposed correlation in much of the discussion, the popular discussion of economy or health, is a false choice. You either do economy and health, and you act quickly and decisively and take decisive action which curtails the disease, or you let it run riot and you wait and see and you do all these things, and that tends to be the less effective approach. And the reason I highlight that is that the lessons really aren't being learned. So in Britain and America, when the virus was relatively suppressed, well, it wasn't quite suppressed in America, but in Britain it was in the summer, there was the option of really following the New Zealand case, which would involve having tight measures instituted when the prevalence of the disease was really quite low. But the choice was not taken, and that applies to several other countries as well within Europe, which have had a similar choice. So although people credit the science and call on the science and science as a popular banner and use and justification for a policy that they feel will be unpopular, I suspect it's a short-term gambit and short-term move, rather than one which actually increases the prevalence and the popularity of the science itself. Would be my guess. The testing ground for this actually might be how the vaccine rolls out and how effectively anti-vax movements are countered and whether they're taken seriously or given a credibility in the media which they don't deserve, and so forth.
I'd love it if some of our more libertarian listeners chipped in with a question and probe in a bit more about the closing down of the economy and the restrictions upon our liberties. So do chip in if you can on that. Let's Sheila de Belague next. Go ahead, Sheila.
Okay, actually, I think that Iain has actually just answered my question absolutely beautifully. But my question was, I've recently heard Dr. Larry Brilliant, the American epidemiologist, talking about how he and indeed plenty of other people predicted a pandemic like this a few years ago. And he said one thing he did not predict was incompetent governments. And is that a fair comment? And does history show that governments have nearly always been incompetent in the face of this kind of thing?
Yes.
And I think you've just shown that some have and some haven't.
Exactly, that's right. So if you look around the world, the record is mixed. You have some which have been very, very, very good indeed. And I think New Zealand is probably can claim to have had the best performance. And others which have been less good. One interesting fact here is how many of the tools put in place, which should in theory have been a means of protection, have actually not only had nil effect, might actually have had the opposite effect. That might actually given false confidence, which actually led to more deaths. So for example, I think there was a report at the beginning of 2020, which claimed Britain and America were the best prepared for a pandemic. And Britain and America, by various measures, have had some of the least good responses to the pandemic. Another factor in here is how we deal with risk. So if you look at how government tends to deal with risk, a standard practice is to assess things on the basis of likelihood and impact. And that model doesn't work actually very well for many less likely but big impact events. In Britain, for example, this applies to the private sector as well. As far as I'm aware, I think Wimbledon, the tennis tournament in the summer, is the only large-scale private sector entity which had a proper pandemic insurance, which it kept paying, and it paid out, and it actually had a proper, it was insured. It cancelled Wimbledon in the summer and got recompense for it to the tune of some £83 million. But that's the exception. As I think most large-scale corporations and most governments took the view that this is a once in a blue moon event, and people at the top of most organisations aren't thinking in that sort of long-term way. So they didn't take the precautions you need to take against it, and obviously we're suffering now. And the idea you can have just-in-time responses works for some things, but not for all things.
It's slightly a tangent, but I was struck when we had a talk 9 months ago about the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, and how back then the president was, he didn't mention the influenza at all, but also the response was down to the states. And I wonder whether politically the structure of the states means that it's actually very difficult for the federal government to take that kind of action. That's the first point. And the second one, is it fair to compare the UK with New Zealand? The UK is an island. Potentially, it could have shut down its airports. It could have been in a position to lock itself off in a way perhaps, Belgium or a country in Europe couldn't, or the states for that matter.
So yes, I mean, I think you're right. New Zealand benefits hugely from being both isolated geographically and also having a relatively low through traffic. So for them to quarantine all new arrivals and be really quite severe in terms of stamping out any instances of the disease was a practical option. It's much harder for the UK to do that, coupled with the fact you don't yet have the political will to do it. So one of the tragedies in medical science is that rarely does the science and the politics align. So generally, when you have the scientific opportunity to stamp out a disease, and you see this with the few diseases which have been stamped out, you tend not to have the political support to take the drastic, strong-armed measures you need to actually do the final step to kill off the disease, because nobody seems to be suffering from it. Whereas at the other end of the scale, when the disease is mass, around everywhere and endemic and lots of people are suffering, there's the political support to do drastic measures, but those measures are much less effective because the disease is so prevalent. Mm-hmm. So it takes quite an unusual political setup to be able to insist on the right scientific measures when you don't have the political support for them.
So you're saying that both the setup, but also the prescience and political will.
Yes, and following your point about the states and the devolution model, this is a problem not unique to America. So in Germany, we're seeing this issue about how the Länder, the regional government in Germany, are coping with the mismatch with the national government. In Britain, we've had issues with the Scottish government, part of the United Kingdom, having some measures which it takes itself, some which are based on a UK base. So again, that's an element of confusion, and it alters the political calculus of leaders. What can they do? Whereas some of these political leaders as well are playing a political game. They want to seem competent. I'm sure that people will have whatever opinions they have about President Trump, but once I think you've taken the decision to minimise perceptions of the virus, to do anything, which was kind of his initial decision back in January, February, to do anything else other than that became something of a political U-turn. So he kind of trapped himself in right from those early weeks, which made it hard for him to take a different line.
Yeah. Okay, Diane Cook. Diane, there you go.
Yeah, no, I've undone it. Iain, you last on your slides, you had that the collective shock is expressed through new culture. And for some time, I've been thinking about, particularly in the UK, the impact on young people of not being educated, not being clear about what's happening, and a whole raft of things. And I was talking to someone today, and there was a very interesting line that it's going to be I think for younger people, it's going to be pre-COVID and post-COVID as a great dividing line. So do you see this as what some of us would consider an opportunity for a larger group, well, a different group of the population to get engaged politically?
I think that's definitely right. I think that's definitely right, and I think you have a number of things which are going to happen. So one thing is, I'm 49 years old. My grandparents, before they passed away, I remember always asking them, "Tell me about the war again," and my grandfather was an air raid warden, and he used to go around the streets of London making sure that people didn't have their lights on when the Blitz was coming. Those things were so exciting and dramatic that the sort of things you ask about many decades after they've happened. And I'm sure that the grandchildren of today's children, in the 2080s, the 2090s, and so on, will be asking the questions, but well, what did you do when you couldn't go to school for a year? And all these sorts of things. So I think it will have a massive impact in that sense. Educationally, if you look at the people who suffered from the 1918 flu, including people who were born immediately after, there was actually a lifelong impact, a lifelong reduction in income, which you can trace to that. And that's associated and being the plausible suggestion is that's a result of the flu. So in other words, it's like to have a lifelong impact, maybe for a generation of kids.
Is that partly related to the age cohort that influenza epidemic affected? Because it primarily affected people between the age of 20 and 40, the most productive people, and also there would be the parents of that generation as well.
So that's right. I mean, I think it's basically people who were in utero at the time. There's a good chance that their mothers suffered in one way or another. Maybe they didn't die, but they had a health impact which went on to have a maybe nutritional impact which affected their income, which I think is significant.
Okay.
On the political line, I think that's an even more fascinating point, because if you look at the way in which, for example, the Second World War legitimized big government in many Western countries, could argue in communist countries too, but certainly in Western countries, in Britain, that then led to the health service, which seemed almost a no-brainer in the late 1940s, whereas it was a radical and an implausible idea in the 1930s. We may well have a similar shift here. So in general, from what I've seen, I think government may have performed better than the private sector, but that's a very preliminary judgment here. If that turns out to be the case and turns out to be the broad perception, that may then legitimize a shift to the left politically. But I think
it's a fascinating point, because there's an ideological schism within, I think, Anglo-Saxon politics, if I can put it that way, between the libertarians, people who voted Trump, people who voted Brexit, people who are horrified by the idea of being forced to wear a mask and this infringement, the economy being shut down. And yet, if the result of all this is to say that the state is going to get bigger, and that taxation is going to get bigger as a result of it, there's a reaction to that. But I guess the money is on the fact that governments need money, and they're going to be increasing taxes, and the only way out of this hole is to spend. So I guess that's the way it goes.
Yes. So, and that actually raises a fascinating point, and the difference from the 1940s. So, whereas in one of the key factors of the 1940s and how that differs now, in the 1940s, you tend to have single national sources of information, national broadcasters, national newspapers, and people got their information from the same source, which meant that when there was a common verdict about how the war had been won, everybody shared it more or less. Nowadays, with social media bubbles, many on the, if you like, the libertarian right to anti-mask, anti-lockdown, all that sort of stuff, they tend to talk to themselves, so they're less likely to come to the collective opinion, well, actually, maybe we've got it wrong. It may mean that the people on the left who are more in favour of stronger government measures with a health aim are more emboldened, but it could then just mean you have greater polarisation with the different groups drawing different conclusions as to how they should respond to the crisis.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. At the end of it, I'm going to force you to do a recap on your 7. And you may, I don't know if you're going to add in some different ones or some different points, but it'll be fascinating to see what your top 7 or your top 10 points are. But I'm going to force you to do that before the end of the hour.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay. Sarah Biffin. This is my mother.
Hello?
Yeah, hi.
It looks as if most of the UK and the Western world will be vaccinated by the end of this year or a bit after. Will we have to wait until all the other poorer and undeveloped countries are vaccinated before we are safe?
That's a fascinating question. So in some ways that's a health question, And so that's somewhere out of my area of expertise, and I wouldn't tackle it from that point of view. But what I would say is that it may well lead to a delayed xenophobic impact. So we may well end up with social views about the rich, clean, developed world versus the poor, dirty, unhealthy outsiders. So then you might end up with greater checks at airports and slightly more discriminatory policies about how people come into the country and so forth. That's just a guess. I don't know whether it'll happen. And I don't know whether that'll be justified by the science and the health medicine, but that's a possibility.
Off the back of that, we have had this massive period after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, of globalization, the freeing up of markets. And then we've seen this contraction again more recently. It's not massive, but it's nevertheless has been happening. So where does that go from here? Do we see more barriers? How do you see that? Yet at the same time, we've had huge cooperation on the scientific level.
That's a good question. Certainly in terms of economically, we've had a big regression. I mean, it's been calculated that we've gone back something like 6 or 7 years in the battle against poverty. Poverty has obviously risen in lots of countries. In terms of the degree to which we exchange goods and services and information, I think the record will be mixed, partly because we have more means now by which we can exchange things, and many of those we can develop means by which they're safer to spread and communicate. So, for example, drones and other technology might mean that automized transport, driverless trucks, for example, might become more common. It also may be that we develop means which mean that next time a similar pandemic strikes, we're more able to deal with it, such as, for example, quarantine zones in airports. The danger there, of course, is that we fight the last war and we anticipate a recurrence of a COVID-type virus, whereas the next virus might be very different. It might be much more lethal, or it might be much more infectious, or something else like that. It might be spread in a different sort of way rather than the airborne prominence of COVID. It will have an impact. I don't think it will shut things down though in the same sort of way. I think whereas the plague really did do that, and it shut down, it sort of isolated some countries. I don't think this COVID will have that sort of effect in the same way.
I guess my question was: does it accelerate the sort of anti-globalization tendency, or is we recognize that this the trade, the technology, we're so plugged into it, it's not going to go away?
That's fair question. I mean, I would tend towards the latter. I think we'll tend towards the latter, and one of the reasons for that is partly because it's generally been older people who've been affected. I think it was younger people who were affected, and younger people tend to be more techno savvy. Then the impact on the prevalence of technology might be greater. But I think for most of the working economy, 2 or 3 years from now, there won't be much of a change on those things. Although having said that, you can imagine that some of the most expensive property in city centres might become less valuable because people realise now actually working from home for many professions is actually more viable than they previously thought it was. So in that sense, we'll have to see.
Ian, this is really fascinating. I feel like I'm talking to a sort of modern day Nostradamus, with qualified predictions. It's really interesting stuff. Let's bring up on Annie McMahon, who is with Simon Jackson. So go ahead, Annie.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you as well. Your hoodie.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you can tell I've got 4 layers of clothing on. What is your forecast for the future of the public debate about how to pay for the measures to tackle the pandemic? I come at this from my point of view. The pandemic has made me go back and challenge my own prejudices against modern monetary theory. I knew I had to go back and rethink what are the good arguments there, because we are going to have a heck of a debate about how we manage the debt load that's going to have been taken on. What's your view?
This is huge, Ian, and I think maybe if we can stand back a bit, because some of this may not be so well versed in economic theory, but if we start with the basics, what is going to be the response of governments to this, and what is the temptation facing them?
So yes, so most governments have suffered a big increase in debt as a result of this crisis. And a number of reasons for that. The tax take is down because so much of the economy has shut down substantially or been working less hard during the time of COVID. Some governments have had support measures which have had an impact on their total government debt. And you can see different governments have had different impacts. Interestingly, interest rates are so low around the world, many of those governments actually haven't had a huge increase in debt repayment. So it's not actually having a huge impact on the budget, but it's a potentially scary problem for the future. In the past, this has happened so often after big wars. In Britain, we've had 3 peaks of debt, and they basically after the Napoleonic Wars in the beginning of the 19th century, after the First World War and after the Second World War. And we've had different ways of responding to them that we've tended to use. And those ways are you can either have austerity, which tends to be very painful and not necessarily effective. You can also have inflation, which can help resolve these things. And I think there's a contrast here with the way we dealt with the great financial crash of some 12 years ago, where there was generally inflation in asset prices. So you found stock markets went up, house prices went up, but consumer prices didn't really go up very much at all. I think this time, my money, such as it's worth, and it might be worth a lot less soon, would be on a resurgence in consumer price inflation. In that seems to be the most likely way to reduce the net impact of government debt. So that would be, and in Britain and the West and the era of central banks, really for the last 25 years, consumer price inflation hasn't been a thing. We've kept inflation generally below 3% within target ranges. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we're looking at inflation being significantly higher for the coming decade, with the acquiescence of central banks allowing that to happen, because it erodes the impact of the national debt. That would be my guess.
You're not the only panelist to have said that in the last year.
Right.
We had the economist from the Sunday Times saying that, and another sort of financier as well. So
yes.
We've been warned.
Yes. So and it does impact, for people who invest in things, it does have an impact in where you invest. It could well mean that the relative value of property in Britain, for example, finally starts to fall after a very, very long run of rises. But we'll have to see. There's a secondary issue to the question there, which is on modern monetary theory, such as a universal basic income. I think there's a chance that comes in, but I think to make it viable, you need to have more effective global taxation. Because I think if you look at the way tax revenue has generally declined over the last few decades, part of that has been that it's easier for people to evade national tax structures. You need to have political will, basically in America and the EU, to clamp down on international tax, avoidance, legitimate. You tighten the rules to make sure you capture that money. And if you do that, then I think a universal basic income, starting at a very low level, starts to become a plausible political reality. But again, this is speculation. It's hard to know how it will actually happen.
All of these things that we're talking about are huge, significant, historical shifts.
Yes.
And it's been amazing. I mean, I know this is all very different for all of us. We haven't lived through a pandemic, but also consciously aware that we're living through a very dramatic point in history as well, which is quite.
Yes. So that's absolutely right. And the other thing, of course, is that when you have profound, big shocks, they change the way people think and what becomes plausible. So some of the things after 9/11, for example, were completely implausible before that time. But when you have this big paradigm shift, it becomes viable. Interestingly, on the universal basic income, that's the opposite of a poll tax. So if you think back to the Black Death, it led to a poll tax in sort of 30 or 40 years later. You had the same in Justinian Rome in the 500s and the 560s, where he even actually taxed dead people because he thought people were evading tax by pretending to be dead, and many of them actually were dead. So rather than having a poll tax suggesting the opposite, it will be a novel turn of events, but it's a plausible happening.
Oh, amazing. Okay, Lois Tart. Lois, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Dark in Australia or just dark in your apartment?
lights are on. Okay. Yes. No, it's not dark in Australia. It's actually early morning. Now, the one thing I will say is the North Atlantic viewpoint is quite different compared to, I'd say, the South Pacific viewpoint. And it's been quite interesting listening to comments and the comparison between the two. And one of the points I'm raising is that there's going to be differences in how countries have responded. And because I work in academia, we've noticed that the impact upon international students. And reading the plague diaries, the plague years, there's a couple of publications. I read them in the early days of the lockdown when I had plenty of time. And they acknowledge that even 50 years later, I think it was Oxford and Cambridge, still hadn't recovered their population levels because of the effect of the Black Death on academics and students. And you can sort of see what's happening there. But, you know, we've had to cut off international students. In Australia, we're getting a forward projection, and this is okay gossip with people from the relevant government department, is that visa applications to study in Australia are double what they were in 2019. The argument then being is that if you want an English language degree, what are your choices? And it's that whole differential outcome. And I've got to admit, some of the debates I'm looking at here and going, hang on, Vietnam's a developing country, but they did really well. So there's the debate from where I'm sitting is quite different from where you're sitting. Go on, Iain.
That's fascinating. No, it is true. And many of these, and in some ways, I think you highlight the Western and UK centricness of my view in the way I approach this question. I think that's interesting. Another thing I'll highlight on there is the way the second bout of the Black Death, second big bout of the Black Death in 1665, led Isaac Newton to go become a recluse and spend a year writing and coming up with some of his most impactful theories. So it may well be that we find out 5-10 years from now that some genius in Japan has done the same thing. We have a new theory of quantum mechanics. We'll have to see.
He's not so used to being a recluse, he didn't bother to mention his discoveries until about 20 or 30 years later.
Yes, so it's been suggested that he actually backdated them to try and avoid. So Leibniz, so calculus, for example, there was a discussion as to who invented calculus, and Isaac Newton claimed it was him, and he claimed he did it in 1665. He may have plagiarized Leibniz and then backdated it to try and claim the credit. We'll have to know. We may never know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any precedent in that. But, anyway, Nigel Harley, thank you, Lewis, for that, for pointing us out. Nigel Harley, go ahead, Nigel.
Yes, hello. I mean, my question really is that I understand that there was a fairly comprehensive report about the potential danger of a pandemic, an international pandemic outbreak, about 2 years ago, at least, probably 3 now, and the government effectively chose to ignore it. I guess my question is, do you think in any way the enormity of this virus will perhaps influence a little bit government thinking a little bit more towards long-term and away from short-term thinking?
Ian, didn't we have the UK at least have a pandemic response plan? I mean, am I right in saying that Taiwan and Singapore had it as a blueprint for their operations, just that they chose to implement it and we didn't?
So this is basically right. So Britain was prepared. I think America was similarly prepared, but we were alas slightly prepared for the wrong sort of thing. So in the case of Britain, we were very ready for a recurrence of a bad flu, and it means you have a different policy response. So for a less lethal virus, it's legitimate to go for herd immunity and to let it spread through the population, because if the number of deaths is relatively low, it's just a question of trying to make sure that your health service isn't overwhelmed. So you're trying to spread them over time.
I was actually thinking, when we talk about that, and I'm sure the history books will sort of look into those weeks in which that was being debated, there was actually government planning suggesting that, and that's what might have guided them.
Yes, exactly. So it was a case of having a little knowledge and it being a dangerous thing. It was the wrong sort of knowledge, the wrong sort of preparedness. And again, I think there's a danger that we learn the same wrong lessons this time. Next time if there's a pandemic, I don't know, in 10 years' time, people will will think back to what they did during COVID and do exactly the same thing, and may be completely inappropriate for whatever reason. We'll have to see.
Right. Okay. I'm just seeing who we've got up next, and I think it's Geraldine Gill, followed by Hilary Matthews. Go ahead, Jerry. Jerry is in Texas, in Houston, Texas. Go ahead, Jerry.
My question, we're having a really bad time here with the distribution of vaccines. We have the vaccines, and in Houston, I just got mine and it was sparse. People are wondering how to get it. In Florida, all the elderly people are standing online in the middle of the night. Do you think that if we had a national health care program, that we could have pulled this off better? Or is it just Donald Trump?
There, and Ian will know a bit about this because he's based in Washington. But just how are you notified? Do you have, is there a local health board? Is it your local doctor? How are you contacted and told we've got a vaccine for you?
In my case, it was a text from a hospital where I was treated for a broken wrist.
And they just got in contact with you because you had been a patient with them previously, and they thought you were
right.
That was your impression. Ian, so what do you make of that, Ian?
So I think you're right. I think I don't think it's fair to well, maybe it is fair, but I think there's a structural problem with the US health system, which is deeper than the current the current president, in that you have a health system which is based around almost a voluntary system, which is individualized, which is appropriate, for example, cosmetic surgery and some other areas where the US offers the best service in the world. But for a mass health issue, it is not the most appropriate. So if you're trying to have and this is where something where you have a social impact and a collective vulnerability. So if one person has a disease, it makes another person vulnerable, and this is where having a national, broader, more egalitarian health system is more appropriate. And I think you can see that this is maybe a worldwide pattern. If you look at, for example, the income distribution of who suffered from the virus most in New York, I remember seeing some very shocking statistics about how there was a very, very tight correlation between income levels and the people who suffered. I suspect that correlates also very closely with people who did or didn't have health insurance. And just also having a familiarity with hospital institutions, I think, is a factor. So I think, yes, I think the lack of a broad, relatively uniform national health service is a negative factor when you're trying to counter this disease, and it may well mean that it legitimizes a more public-based health option in the future in the US.
That's an absolutely amazing thought, because within US politics, particularly on the right, it's almost sacrilegious to suggest that you could have something like a national health service when the Democrats are being painted as socialists. But maybe, as you say, this will shift people's thinking. Yeah. Hilary Matthews, go ahead, Hilary. Hilary, are you there? Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
You can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think Ian has basically answered my question over the last 10 or 15 minutes, but I wondered if you would dare to stick your neck out and make a prediction as to how long it will take the UK and the Western world in general to recover from this pandemic. And I presume you might say that it would depend on the competence of governments, and in particular the competence of the people in charge of the money. But you did say, for instance, that we're 6 to 7 years backwards in dealing with poverty rates, and you talked about the basic income and inflation. But are we looking at 5 to 10 years before we're back where we were a year ago? Can you have any idea on that?
Ian, it has to be at least that, doesn't it?
So, well, I would think within the developed world, I would think you have a much quicker response. So once you can have broad vaccination of most people in a society, then first of all, it means that COVID becomes much less of a threat because people suffer from it much less, and also means it's transmitted much less. So within a few months of having a large number of people vaccinated, you can more or less get your economy back. you can then also prime it with cash giveaways, basically borrowing debt to supercharge it, to kick it off to begin with, which should mean that within a year or two, an economy has mostly recovered, I would think. And there's some areas to suggest that. So that's in terms of your annual output would have recovered. You then have your long-lasting impact. So you have the impact of kids not learning properly for a year, which will be, affect some kids more than others. Kids that didn't have access to the computers would be much worse, suffer much more than those which have. And also you've got your big backlog of debt. So dealing with those will take a much longer time, but you should be able to get the annual output of the economy to recover relatively swiftly. The poverty I was referring to is worldwide. So what you're seeing is that poorer countries in the world, where often they haven't had a big health impact, they have had a big economic impact, and that's obviously affected the poorest people most. And recovering that you'll probably just get back on the track you were. So we've lost 5 years and we're back to where we were in 2014, 2015 or so.
Ian, that's been absolutely fascinating. We're going to, it's come to the end of our hour, so we're going to have a break now, but please do stay on the line, everyone, and we'll come back for the discussion. I just want to point ahead to our next talk. So my thanks very much to Iain King for his time. It's been a really, really fascinating discussion, a modern Nostradamus, as I was saying earlier.